Greetings, dear friends, fellow programmers, and those aspiring to be. Alright folks, are you ready to become a JavaScript Promise Pro? Well, if the answer was yes, I would like to invite you to sit down and enjoy the ride where we will be learning about promise chaining in JavaScript. Okay, let's kick things off with a mind-blowing fact. Did you know that JavaScript promises and promise chaining can revolutionize the way you handle asynchronous operations in JavaScript? Are you intrigued? Well, you should be. Now let's take a deep dive into the world of promises in JavaScript, because after mastering these, you will definitely be a way better developer. Because after utilizing promises in JavaScript, you will definitely end up writing code that is way more performant and elegant. And also, you'll be handling asynchronous operations like a breeze. I mean, we all want to do the asynchronous programming in our JavaScript, but usually people end up using callbacks and end up with the callback hell scenario, because that's what happens when you nest a lot of functions within other functions in order to make the asynchronous behaviors come to reality. But in the end, when you weigh your benefits and problems, you might end up with the wrong side of the scale. And that is exactly where promises jump in to the rescue. Because if you utilize promises properly, you will end up with a code that is, as we already mentioned, elegant and performant as well as efficient, all the while looking very clean and tidy. Now, to get a firm grasp on this concept of chaining promises, you can imagine it like you're a wizard in RPG game, and you are going to be spell casting and throwing some spells on enemies. But in order to improve the efficiency and power of your spells, you need to chain them together. And it has to be done in a given sequence of spells. You cannot just randomly cast some spells and end up with some huge damaging spells. You need to do it in a right order. And if we say that a spell is basically a promise, it's identical approach. Because with promises, you want to be able to chain them in exactly the order we want to have in our code. So we want to have complete control over exact steps that are going to be executed and their order of execution. So in the end, we can make ourselves an amazing coding wizard. Of course, if you are struggling with the concept of promises at this point, and have not seen my previous video dedicated to basics about promises, I highly recommend you to invest a few minutes and take a look at it, because there I explain what promises are, and I'll give you some very simple examples to get a firm grasp on the concept. So if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend you to jump into that video and then come right back to this one. And then when you do that, you will get all the benefits that this video is supposed to give you. And now that we got it out of the way, I take it you are completely familiar with the basics about promises, so it is better time than ever to jump into our IDE environment and see how chaining promises works in action. Let's go! So, welcome to our IDE environment. Right here we have a very simple example that I wanted to show to you and explain how promise chaining works. So, as you can see here, we're utilizing fetch method provided by JavaScript, which is going to make a call to the given endpoint and fetch some data for us. So when fetching data from this API endpoint is resolved, or we get the response from it, then we will do the following. We will make this response converted into JSON. So that is our next chain in our promise chaining process. So as you can see, we received a response, which is going to be the response from this API endpoint, and then we just return response converted into JSON. Then in the next then statement, we have received data which is going to be this part right here, so response payload converted into JSON. Then we use that data to log it using console log operation and invoke another fetch method. So we're going to reach out to another API endpoint, ask for some additional data that we need for whatever reason, and when that is done, we will end up in this then statement. So basically, when invoking fetch for the second time, we are creating another promise, and when this second promise is resolved, we will end up in this section right here, which is going to be receiving extra response, which is going to be the response of the second API call. And then we do exactly the same thing as in the first scenario. So we are converting it into JSON. And then when we have done that, we are using that extra data, or basically the second API call's response data converted into JSON. So this is that. And we just log it. And also, as was the case in our base explanation about promises, we have built-in mechanisms for handling failing scenarios. That is the case here as well, so if any of these two API calls fails to execute for whatever reason, we will end up in this section right here, printing the console error message, which is going to give us all the feedback we might need to fix the issue and keep working as expected. And now that we covered that, you can see that basically promise chaining is not complicated at all. It's fairly simple. You're just chaining then statements that are going to be executed one after another, basically flattening the execution flow and making it sequential, meaning that one action has to be done before we jump to the next one. And we can also pass the payload that we want to work in the next one. So as you saw in the example, it's fairly straightforward and the code is not nested at all, which is nice. So now, the moment you've been waiting for, it's time to discuss everything, but this time with a more meaningful example that we can actually run. Because in the first example I was using made-up API endpoints, so if I were to run the code, we would get nothing, nada, nil, whatever you want to say, we would get nothing and end up in our catch section because the API endpoints do not exist. We need to change that. We want to work with a code that is actually going to be buildable and runnable. This time we are preparing for coding competition and we want to do all the necessary steps to make the chances of us winning the competition as high as possible. Which means that we need to perform 3 steps. The first one being we need to practice, then we need to run mock tests to check if our code works as expected, and the third aspect is dedicated to performance, because we want our code to be as performant as possible. Now let's jump to our IDE environment and see what I have in store for you. And welcome back. As you can see, I have prepared 3 separate methods, the first one being practice coding, second one is take mock test, and the third one is review performance. So each of these 3 methods is going to return a new promise where we will create some set timeout method utilization, and we just log that everything was done when the timer has counted down to 0. So basically, after that is done, we will resolve the promise with a message we provide to it. The first one is going to log that we have practiced coding problems. Then we are going to resolve our promise with a message that we are ready for mock test. And when this set timeout counts to 0, then this piece of code is going to be executed. And we have basically exactly the same scenario in the other 2 methods as well. So nothing specific that we want to address here because we are already familiar with the basics. And now finally, let's get to a point where we will be invoking each of these methods. So we will first start our practice coding function. So when its promise is resolved, we will end up in this part right here. This result is going to be the message that we are providing in this line right here. When we are resolving this promise, we will return a message, And that message is going to be in this result object right here. And we are passing it to our takeMockTest method as a parameter. When we do this, we will end up in this timeout, and when this timeout counts to 0, we will then log first this message we have provided, then we will log that we are taking mock test, and finally we are resolving the promise with another message. And this message will end up in this then statement, which we will enter after this promise is resolved, and we will basically provide this message right here to our final method, which is reviewPerformance as a parameter. So we have exactly the same scenario as for testing, and we'll log this message we have received from this line right here, and we log the message that we have reviewed performance, and we are then resolving our promise, which will take us to this part right here, where we'll just log the resulting message provided that everything is done. And of course, if everything goes wrong, we will end up in this catch section right here, which is a standard procedure already. So when I run the code, we should see we're first practicing coding, then we are ready for the mock test, then we took the mock test, then we are ready for review performance, then we have reviewed the performance, and then we print that everything is executed and done. It seems like all of our promise chaining logic is in place and does exactly what we want it to. And there you have it, my friend. We have just mastered how to chain promises and how to execute multiple actions sequentially, so that we are waiting for the previous action to be done before we get started with the next one. That way, we're making machines that will be executing stuff asynchronously, but in a given order. So that is something you will use a lot in your day-to-day life as a programmer in JavaScript for sure. I mean, in any programming language, not just JavaScript. So if you enjoyed this video, I would like to invite you to take a look at the video series dedicated to asynchronous programming in JavaScript, because there you will see everything from the beginnings and callbacks and synchronous code all the way to promises that we are talking about right now. And in the upcoming videos, we will be talking about async await functions and additional, even more advanced functionalities that can be used to improve your performance in code, best practices, error handling logic, and things of those sorts. So stick around, subscribe to the channel, because a lot of value is on the way. Thank you for watching, and have an amazing day. Happy coding!